reconvene as the Sewer Utility District Commission, and everyone that was here before is still here. So we will move right on to approval of the meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from August 8th?
Move to approve.
Motion and a second. Are there any comments or questions? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the minutes are approved. Which brings us to our first discussion item, sewer budget discussion and recommendation for borrowing or self-funding for the fiscal year 2024 capital expenditures and 5-year capital improvement program. Director Lundin will give us a quick intro here.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We are otherwise looking to seek some policy guidance ahead of generating the utility. So I do want to be clear, we're looking for guidance. While we did provide some monetary examples in the packets, we're really just looking for the direction as it relates to the capital funding moving forward. And then you will see the actual generation of the budget numbers based on that policy guidance that you provide here tonight. As an overview, we have a priority project listed in our capital funding, which is the replacement of Lift Station E. It is our biggest lift station. It takes flow from several other tributary lift stations and is the next upstream capacity issue in the East Trunk sewer that must be addressed to help reduce the number of sanitary sewer overflows and basement backups that we see typically in wet weather events. That project for the replacement of the station, which is also beyond its life cycle, the standalone project for that itself is estimated to be $8.8 million, and with some of the ancillary projects that would also address the surcharging adjacent to this station, the range would go upwards of $11 million. The total in the 5-year CIP is approximately $18.8 million. We're looking at a projected year-end balance of $5.1 million. With some additional undesignated cash reserves. You may recall a year ago we came forward for the water utility to request a policy to be able to reallocate portions of those undesignated cash reserves. We do anticipate that coupling with the budget this year to ask for a similar policy for the utility, and if otherwise considered or approved, there is approximately $1.3 million of undesignated cash reserved that, with permission, could be reallocated towards some of these capital funding projects. Even with all of that, at current levy and current rates, we're projected to be in a deficit for capital funding by year 3 of the 5-year plan. So ahead of either modifying the 5-year plan or otherwise adjusting the budget, we're looking first for your guidance on a couple different options. Certainly number one would be to reduce the number of projects in the 5-year CIP or slow the implementation. So in other words, we could do less projects over a longer period of time so that we spread out those capital needs. The majority of those that are listed in the 5-year CIP do deal with sewer capacity issues. Those are those that are leading to those sewer overflows or basement backups. So we do have concerns that slowing too much may be subject to the frequency of those rain events that cause those backups. We could also certainly look at either eliminating or pausing on the other projects that are not related to Lift Station E and instead concentrate only on that project. You may recall that on an annualized basis, we do many other routine capital projects such as pipelining to try and keep the water out of the system. That also helps address our surcharging, as well as routine replacement of pumps or other infrastructure related to lift stations. We are concerned that too much of a delay in some of those capital projects could cost the utility more in the end, that unfortunately we've only seen costs rise over time. And there is a concern that if we delay too much, that those costs could go up. But on the contrary, they could also be reduced. We could see a change in either material costs or the labor market that could result in waiting being a better prospect than what we're seeing right now. So to be clear, regardless of the direction, we will otherwise address the CIP accordingly. So the one that was otherwise provided was an example, but it can certainly be adjusted. We truly only budget on an annualized basis. We're just trying to do our best job of showing you what the 5-year recommendations are as we do an outlook. But those aren't decisions that we're asking you to make either tonight or as a part of those budgets. So with that said, we are projecting again a deficit by year 3 in capital funding. So we're seeking guidance on the Sewer Utilities District Commission's direction to borrow for all or some of those capital projects, to self-fund for those, or to use some combination of those two options. And when we look at borrowing versus self-funding, certainly on the borrowing side, there is the view of the climate of interest rates and whether or not it's a good time to borrow. To be clear, we're not asking to borrow now. The project itself for Lift Station E alone wouldn't likely be bid until third quarter of next year. We do have some capital funding available, so if at the time of that project the interest rates aren't right, we could certainly move forward with at least starting the project. And depending on the decisions made about those budgets would depend on whether we have enough self-funding for that project or whether borrowing would be warranted. What we don't want to do is miss the opportunity to self-fund if that's the direction given by the commission to otherwise do so. On a staff side, we would note that time is of the essence as it relates specifically to that Lift Station E project. We are looking to begin construction in the fiscal year 2024, but it is likely that even that would span at least 2 fiscal years, which would allow us not only the capital funding in 2024, but also 2025 for that project. So I'm going to take maybe a pause on this to start and ask for some guidance as it relates to capital funding, as it relates to borrowing, self-funding, or some combination of the two.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a healthy discussion about this morning. I'll just kind of cut to the end. I think some combination of we always self-fund a little bit, but we shouldn't be afraid to use debt where it makes sense. Like I think bullet 4 reflects past policy for larger pieces of infrastructure, like a lift station that's probably going to have a 30 or 40 year useful life. We've tended to borrow for those. In the packet, you might have seen some of the assumed interest rates. Those were provided by, I think, by Ellers recently. And while they're certainly higher than we've enjoyed recently, at least the 10-year note wasn't completely outrageous. It was 4.5%, which is kind of in line with where inflation settled down to here. So it's not terrible. It'll cost us more, certainly, than we've paid in the past. But we want to obviously balance taking on too much, just paying too much in interest over the life of the program, versus more principal. But I think some combination, like me personally, of funding what we can with what the means we have, taking on debt where it makes sense, but also being sensitive to how the cost of that all flows into the tax rate structure. So we should look at the user rates too, the user fee portion. Sewer is an interesting one to me, where the value of the service isn't determined by the value of the structure it's hooked up to. It's taking the same product away from the house no matter what. So I think it's appropriate to look at all of it to some extent. And certainly, as Kristen mentioned, once we have better idea what these projects cost, timing them appropriately, because even if we self-fund some and borrow some, they may not fit into our ability to budget. I think one point that is important to point out is there's the discussion of using tax levy. That's a different discussion if you're levying for increased capital charges versus taking on debt. Debt is exempt from the levy limit discussion, so if you take on debt and it raises the levy, that's exempt from it makes my head hurt to think about why the state made that distinction, but that's the distinction they made. So that we've only got, as we talked about last night, we've only got 248,000, I think, available of total levy capacity for the whole city, not just the sewer utility. That's under 5 cents per thousand, which isn't a lot of margin to play with. I think we'd be wise to preserve that for future flexibility. I'm happy to entertain other people's opinions, but that sums up where the discussion sort of ended up this morning anyway.
And perhaps we can't have one conversation without the other. We were maybe, trying to get the inclination on borrowing versus self-funding to start before we went into the discussion about the sewer levy versus user rate. And I will certainly not claim to be an expert by any means on the levy side. I will just otherwise clarify with the support of finance staff, hopefully, that we do have the ability to apply the levy increase between the two funds rather than on a pro rata basis. So it's not a direct comparison in terms of the impact on the sewer levy versus the impact on the general levy.
It might get us an extra penny because
Well,
of the
and
difference of the amount of equalized value that's in versus out. But
And I guess to that point,
about
it
5
is
cents.
just a matter if you were looking at it at what a penny on the sewer levy gets us in comparison to 10 cents on the rate or $1 on the residential user charge. It is the difference between $19,000 and $45,000. So again, understanding that it is an impact to the user in the end, no matter what, there is a difference in what it provides in terms of that net funding increase.
Any other feedback from any of the sewer utility district commissioners? Commissioner Parrish.
I didn't understand either why it was kind of two separate agenda items because I keep going ahead to the sewer levy. I appreciate the discussion, but you guys have already had it. If interest is indeed as cheap as it is in the packet, it is tempting. I guess I just don't really believe that that's what it will be, like 4.5% or 5%. I mean, that's a great rate. Historically, from 2015 through 2018, the rate was $1.90 or above, and then a few years ago we dropped down to $1.62, $1.60. I think that's because we paid off some debt and other
We revalued.
so it enabled us to drop down.
And we opted out of the green infrastructure program, which significantly reduced the levy impact.
So if you self-funded, have you done the analysis yet? Like what that would come up to? Is it $1.70?
Well,
'Cause that's
again, we were trying to get some guidance before we put all the numbers together because we do understand, especially I was here last night as well, there is an immense amount of discussion about the impact on the levy. And as staff, we wouldn't want to come forward with a budget that otherwise proposed, for example, an increase on the levy if the Sewer Utility District Commission wasn't otherwise interested in increasing the levy at all. And so there is certainly ways to provide capital funding either through the levy or through the rate. And so we wanted to understand the tolerance. That too can be a combination of the two. It doesn't have to be exclusively restricted to the levy or the rate, but that's why we tried to give the example of what we gain in terms of, again, a penny on the levy versus 10 cents on the rate was just to show what the comparison is. We would have to raise rates more steeply in comparison to what they are now to gain the same amount of net funding increase as a penny on the tax rate.
Yeah. Well, I just think we may have dropped rates artificially low for when we knew we had all this upcoming stuff. I know we had those levy limits. That's
We
partially
kept
why
the
we did.
budget flat, but we revalued all the property.
Well,
So
that's
the
why it
net-
dropped
the-
down. Okay.
Yeah, that and the green infrastructure
Okay.
program,
So the tax
which
never
we were
went up.
paying in
Okay.
money, but we were only getting
Got it.
50 cents on the dollar back. So
Okay. Well, there's some formula that makes sense. So we need more analysis.
I think it's different if you add levy to self-fund versus adding levy because you took on debt. One counts against the limit and one doesn't. So if you look at some of the numbers in there, you'd be hard pressed to save more, raise the rates more than I think 5 or 6 cents a thousand, and we'd hit that $250,000 a year pretty quickly. But if you did it via borrowing, it would be higher than that, but it wouldn't count against your levy limit. We're down to our last 5 or 6 cents, depending on which entity you're talking about with levy limit ability. I
And
wouldn't
that
want to flush it down the drain for the lack of risk of creating a joke there, but
And that is I guess, a policy that we're looking for as well. That again, there's the difference between the idea that you're not interested in impacting the levy at all versus you're not interested in impacting the levy as it relates to levy limits. Because obviously the end user, the result is the same. Their levy is increased, whether it's for debt or whether it's for self-funding. The result in terms of their payment is the same. But if you give us policy direction that a levy rate increase due to borrowing is acceptable, but a levy rate increase due to self-funding is not acceptable, then that helps guide us as we look at the capital funding in terms of where we may be able to do so and the timing of such, because obviously we wouldn't increase rates now for a borrowing. We're not proposing a borrowing. There's not one actively to do so. So then we wouldn't otherwise be proposing a levy rate increase, but we would certainly be signaling that there would be one if there had to be a borrowing.
Can I just clarify something?
sure. Commissioner
so
Schneider.
You will have accrued some money that has accrued over the years, and you had some left over from the other sewer project, and it looks as though on page 8 here that you're switching a little bit of funding around so that you're putting more in the sanitary lift station fund that used to be in the in one of the other funds, the main force fund. So it looks like you are doing some efforts to accumulate funding for this project, and I'm just wondering, in aggregate, how much of the project do you think you can accrue without increasing the levy? I mean, how much, where are we in terms of the needle in terms of funding this whole $18 million?
Well, again, the balance in all of the capital counts right now is 5.1 million. So that's if we requested a budget transfer to put them all into the lift station fund, there would be $5.1 million, or we project that there would be $5.1 million at year end. So for lift station E alone, if we were going to self-fund, we would need approximately $3.2 million to get us to the 8.8.
Gotcha.
I think it works out to be a 10 or 15 year plan if it's if there's no amount of levy.
So I
the
agree that we
board.
should minimize, I mean, we don't want to take on unnecessary debt. I mean, debt, I mean, you wouldn't call it unnecessary, but given the fact that interest rates are not yet as low as we are accustomed to, it makes some sense, as the mayor was saying, to aggregate some money to see what we can accumulate and maybe increase the levy a little bit, and then as we reach the point of needing to borrow, then we have some of it already accrued, and we don't go out to market to borrow the whole amount. That makes more sense to me, just from a practical standpoint.
There's some ability to look at timing of projects too. it might be likely that all 18 million doesn't have to happen in the next 5 years. We're probably about 10 years or so away from the East Trunk sewer debt rolling off, and then that creates capacity within the levy to pay more too. But one of the other things we talked about was after getting through this year's budget, looking at this more long range. We're going to be doing some other long range capital planning for the city on other items. We may as well throw this on there as well, because we'll be doing the same exercise. And it's all stuff we have to do in the next 5-10 years anyway. So I know it's a little bit difficult in your chair to sit there tonight and you don't have any real specificity about what projects, exactly what dollars, at what timing, and there's no longer range forecast on rates, but it certainly was a struggle when I read through the packet too, and we discussed that this morning. So I think everything's on the board, moving projects around in time, using self-funding, borrowing where it makes sense, like for larger items that are, you know, more capital intensive and have a long lifetime.
Well, and maybe if I might summarize a little bit, I'm not, or I'm hearing from those that spoke, maybe more support for levy increases for borrowing than for self-funding, but there's not opposition to reviewing rates and what they may be able to provide for self-funding to either soften the cushion of future borrowing, or at least to provide more seed money as we move forward to discuss the timing of those projects.
I think my personal opinion is I'd look more on the user fee side for more self-funding capacity, because if we use it on the levy side up front, we're eating away at the rest of the city's last nickel of potential taxing authority without going to a referendum. We're extraordinarily thin there. That's my opinion. I don't get the final say. We got 8 other commissioners, well, 7 tonight. Commissioner Meyer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, we can always reject a future borrowing later. We're not committing to anything tonight. I would like to too, but I wouldn't want to use our last nickel of taxing authority.
But you don't have to. You could do it through rates.
Yeah, but I'm just saying yes on rates, no on levy.
And I just,
I don't know.
correct me if I'm wrong, I
that's
just
clear
heard
for
you
everyone.
you suggest self-fund versus borrow, which again, I know was our intent to try and separate the questions, to try to get to the idea that if we're self-funding, that then the conversation about rates versus levy comes into play in terms of how we're gaining that net increase. So, okay.
Good to clarify. Any other feedback from the commission? Is that enough feedback to bring forward a budget in a couple weeks?
Yes, I think
Okay.
we've got some, certainly a lot of math to do that we would have to do anyway, but understanding the guidance helps us put the numbers where we think they should be.
Okay. Any other parting comments, or is there a desire to move on to the next topic? Next topic, I heard. Okay. Next item was sewer budget discussion and recommendation for increasing the levy or user rates. We just
We ended both together.
did both.
We're good.
We did two at once. All right, we did it all at once.
Yes.
Fantastic. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?